Imagine this. The Vikings, right? Those amazing explorers heading out across the North Atlantic, setting up camp, even reaching North America. What kept them going on those incredibly long trips? Believe it or not, it was mostly dried cod.
Yeah, it sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But this dried fish was lightweight, full of protein, and it lasted forever. It was basically their power bar for exploring.
Exactly. Without it, who knows how early the exploration might have played out.
It really does make you think. That one food source just opened up so many possibilities.
And that little fact is just scratching the surface of the story we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into Mark Kurlansky's fantastic book, Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world.
And biography is definitely the right word. Kurlansky takes us across, 1,000 years of history, showing how this one fish influenced economies, cultures, entire ways of life on 4 different continents. It's way more than just a book about fishing.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to pull out the key insights from Kurlansky's work to show you how something that seems so ordinary, a fish, had these massive world-changing effects. We're talking exploration, trade, revolution, and even, unfortunately, ecological disaster.
Quite a journey for one species.
Okay, let's get started. Let's dive into cod's really early history and how it got tangled up in global exploration right from the beginning. So Kurlansky starts way back, tracing cod's influence, and he brings us to the Basques. They're this really interesting group straddling the border between Spain and France.
Right, and they have that unique language, Euskera, that's just sort of survived against all odds for centuries. They were known as shepherds, sure, but also as these incredibly skilled seafarers.
And what Kurlansky highlights is their skill with cod. They weren't just drying it, they had these really specific salting techniques.
Exactly. That was the key. It allowed the cod to be preserved for much longer, which meant longer voyages, and the ability to actually trade it further afield. This know-how basically let them build an early fish-based economy.
And it seeped into the culture too, didn't it? Kurlansky mentioned Cervantes referencing cod, showing it was already a big deal in places like Castile.
It became a staple. But they weren't the only ones figuring this out. You mentioned the Vikings earlier.
Yeah, it's fascinating how different groups saw the potential. The Vikings absolutely relied on dried cod to fuel those huge journeys from Norway all the way to North America. Just imagine months at sea living off dried fish.
It must have been incredibly tough. But that shared value, that reliance on cod, turned it into a major commodity pretty quickly. By the 1400s, everyone in Europe seemed to want it.
And a big part of that demand, maybe surprisingly, was the Catholic Church.
Right. With meat off the menu for nearly half the year on fasting days, cod became almost a religious necessity, a staple food.
So religious practice ends up driving this huge economic engine, benefiting groups like the Basques, but also attracting others.
Definitely. But where there's money, there's often control. The Hanseatic League, this powerful group of German merchant guilds, they pretty much had a monopoly on the cod trade for a while.
Which really didn't sit well with, say, English merchants out of Bristol.
Not at all. In fact, Kurlansky argues that trying to break that Hanseatic stranglehold was a major reason they started desperately searching for new fishing grounds themselves.
Which leads us directly to John Cabot's voyage in 1497.
Exactly. He wasn't looking for cod necessarily, but he found it in spades. He reported back about this codlandia off North America where the sea was supposedly so thick with fish you could just lower a basket and pull them up.
Maybe a slight exaggeration, but...
Maybe just a bit. But the report itself kicked off this absolute frenzy, a sort of gold rush for fish. And right away, it cemented the New World's connection to the cod trade.
It's just amazing, isn't it, how perfecting a way to salt and dry fish by cultures like the Basques and Vikings turned it into this global engine-driving exploration and reshaping trade for centuries.
It really laid the groundwork for so much that followed.
So cod-fueled exploration opened up the Atlantic. But its story gets even more complex. It becomes deeply embedded in building new nations, especially in North America. Let's jump ahead a bit to New England.
Right. And the Pilgrims arrive, famously, in this land teeming with cod, but they didn't really know what they were doing at first.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? Starving in a land of plenty because they lacked the skills and the right gear, while English fishing fleets were already making fortunes just offshore.
But Kurlansky points out they eventually learned, importantly, from the local Nemkig people. They set up fishing stations, and New England started to find its footing.
And they had advantages over places like Newfoundland, right?
Yeah, the milder winters helped, allowing for year-round fishing closer to shore. This fostered a more entrepreneurial spirit, a different kind of economy compared to the seasonal, company-dominated fisheries further north.
And it worked. By the 1700s, cod fishing wasn't just feeding people. It had turned New England into a real economic powerhouse.
A powerhouse built on cod, which led to this phenomenon Kurlansky calls the codfish aristocracy.
Tell us about them. It sounds quite grand.
Well, these were the elite merchant families in Massachusetts, primarily. They got incredibly wealthy from the cod trade, and they weren't shy about it. The book says they openly worshipped the fish as the symbol of their wealth.
So it wasn't just money, it was identity.
Exactly. They put cod motifs on buildings, on currency, even on official seals. It became this potent symbol of New England's prosperity and maybe its sense of self-importance to really define their place in the colonial world.
There's a darker side to this prosperity that Kurlansky doesn't shy away from.
No, he doesn't. And this is where the story gets really uncomfortable, actually.
Because New England's cod wealth was directly tied into the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, it's stark. The lowest grade salt cod, the stuff not good enough for European markets, was shipped down to the Caribbean. It became the cheap protein fed to enslaved people working the brutal sugar plantations.
So cod was a crucial piece of that horrific triangular trade. Fish from New England, sugar and molasses from the Caribbean, slaves from Africa.
Precisely, and Kurlansky points out the deep moral contradiction, something even observers like Alexis de Tocqueville noted later on. New England championing liberty, while its economy was significantly boosted by profiting from slavery.
It really forces you to think, doesn't it? How do we evaluate that kind of economic success when it's built on something so fundamentally wrong? The book really makes you grapple with that.
It absolutely does. And that economic engine, the drive to protect those profits, ties directly into the American Revolution, too.
Kurlansky makes a strong case that the Revolution wasn't just about high ideals. For many Massachusetts merchants, it was fundamentally about economics.
Yeah, he argues it was practically driven by economic interest, particularly the right to control and profit from their own ventures, like the all-important cod fishery.
You see figures like John Adams fighting tooth and nail, not just for independence, but specifically to secure fishing rights in the negotiations with Britain after the war.
Absolutely. Those British regulations, things like the Molasses Act, the Sugar Act, they were seen as direct attacks on the profitability of the cod trade and the whole system it supported. It wasn't just taxes, it was about economic freedom, their freedom anyway.
So cod wasn't just food, or even just money. It became a symbol of sovereignty, of the fight for self-determination, at least for those merchants.
A very powerful symbol indeed.
Okay, moving into the industrial age, the fishing itself. It remained incredibly dangerous work, didn't it? Even as things started to change.
Oh, absolutely. Kurlansky gives you a real sense of the conditions on the Grand Banks. We're talking extreme cold, fishing in deep, treacherous waters, the constant danger of fog, storms, icebergs.
Especially for the dorymen, the guys who went out in those tiny little boats,
Yeah.
sometimes miles from the main ship.
Yeah, the book shares some terrifying accounts like Howard Blackburn's story getting separated in a blizzard, freezing his hands to the oars to keep rowing. Just unbelievable hardship. Kurlansky talks about this risk creating a terrifying death without witnesses.
But he also talks about the flip side, that intense bond between the fishermen.
A warm camaraderie, he calls it. This sense of being an elite group facing down danger together. It's a culture forged in shared risk and, sadly, shared loss. You feel Kurlansky really respects that spirit.
And while the risks maybe didn't lessen, the methods certainly started evolving. They weren't just using single hand lines anymore.
Right. You see the shift towards things like long lining, which the French introduced early on. Instead of one hook, now you have these incredibly long lines, sometimes miles long, with thousands of baited hooks. Much more efficient.
More efficient, yes. But Kurlansky points out that even these early innovations started raising questions.
Exactly. More fish caught meant more competition, and you start hearing the first murmurs about, well, are there enough fish? It foreshadows the bigger problems of overfishing that were still decades away. The seeds were there.
And then technology really takes a leap. Sailing ships slowly give way to engine power.
A slow transition, but significant. And then comes a figure who completely changes the market side of things. Clarence Birdseye.
Ah, yes, Mr. Frozen Food himself.
That's the one. Kurlansky tells his story, how working as a fur trapper up in Labrador, He saw how quickly fish froze solid in the Arctic cold and stayed fresh. He experimented and eventually perfected quick freezing technology for food.
Which completely revolutionized how people bought and ate fish.
Totally. Suddenly you didn't need salt cod anymore. You could have frozen fillets and later things like fish sticks. Kurlansky notes it made fish preparation less of a drudgery for home cooks and opened up huge new markets far from the coast.
But this march of technology, from engines to freezing to even more advanced fishing gear, it had a major downside.
A huge one. We start seeing factory ships that process fish right out at sea. Otter trawls, these enormous nets dragged along the ocean floor, catching everything in their path. Pair fishing, using 2 boats to tow even bigger nets. Sonar to find the fish.
Each step making it easier and easier to catch vast quantities of cod.
Easier, yes, but devastatingly effective. It led directly to massive overfishing, wiping out stocks, damaging the seabed habitat, basically setting the stage for the ecological crises to come.
Which brings us to these really intense international conflicts over the remaining fish, the Cod Wars.
Right. After World War II, fishing had been reduced, so stocks in the North Atlantic actually bounced back a bit. Iceland, having gained full independence in 1944, saw its chance.
They weren't happy with the old rules, the traditional 3-mile fishing limit.
Not at all. They unilaterally extended their limit first to 4 miles, then significantly to 12 miles in 1958. And that's what really sparked the first Cod War with Britain, who had historically fished those waters heavily.
These weren't actual shooting wars though, right?
No, not declared wars. But they were tense confrontations. Iceland's Coast Guard became quite famous, or infamous depending on your view, for using this special tool, basically a giant pair of cutters, to slice the trawl wires of British fishing boats, destroying their nets.
Wow, direct action.
Very direct. There were 3 main Cod Wars over the next couple of decades, involving naval maneuvers, rammings, diplomatic rows, until Iceland eventually won recognition for a 12-mile limit, then 50, and finally a 200-mile exclusive economic zone by 1975.
A huge victory for a small nation.
Monumental. And Kurlansky stresses for Iceland this wasn't just about economics. He says, fishing was not just an economic activity, it is a vital thread in the fabric of Icelandic identity. They were fighting for their survival and their culture.
But compare Iceland's success in managing its resource with what happened in Newfoundland. It's such a stark contrast in the book.
It really is. Newfoundland, which had been the historical heartland of cod fishing for centuries, joined Canada as a province after WWII. And the Canadian government took a very different approach.
They focused on the big offshore trawlers, didn't they?
Yeah, they heavily subsidized the large industrial offshore fleet, often ignoring the warnings from the inshore fishermen, the ones fishing closer to shore in smaller boats who were seeing the cod disappear firsthand.
Kurlansky describes this as a kind of collective denial about overfishing.
Exactly. The inshore guys felt like they were shouting into the wind. As one fisherman put it, we were complaining to the wind. The government, driven by industry pressure and perhaps short-term economic thinking, just didn't listen until it was too late.
And the result was catastrophic.
Utterly. In 1992, the Canadian government had to impose a complete moratorium on fishing for northern cod. They essentially declared the stock commercially extinct. 30,000 people lost their jobs overnight. Whole communities were devastated.
It's chilling. And that chapter title in the book, Iceland Discovers the Finite Universe, it really hits home. That realization that these resources weren't infinite after all.
A brutal lesson. It marked a real turning point in how we had to think about the oceans.
So where does that leave cod today? The future seems pretty uncertain, based on Kurlansky's account.
Deeply uncertain. In Newfoundland, you still hear debates. Some fishermen, Kurlansky writes, hold on to this deep belief, almost faith, that the cod will come back because they have to. It speaks to that long connection with nature's cycles.
But the scientists are much more cautious.
Very cautious. They stress that recovery isn't guaranteed, especially when a population collapses so dramatically. You know, the line in the book is stark. If you get to 0, it will produce 0. Recovery takes time and the right conditions, which might have changed.
And you have examples elsewhere, like Norway.
Right. Norway faced similar issues, but implemented really strict regulations much earlier, listening to the science, and their cod stocks actually recovered quite impressively. It shows that management can work, but it requires political will.
Which Canada seemed to struggle with, facing pressures from industry.
Exactly. It highlights the difficult interplay between science, economics, and politics in managing natural resources. And the concern isn't just cod, obviously.
Kurlansky broadens it out, right? To overfishing globally.
Yes, he talks about the decline of many other fish species worldwide, the interconnectedness of marine life. He even touches on the potential risks of large-scale fish farming, like genetic impacts on wild fish if farmed ones escape.
And the cultural impacts continue too.
Profoundly. Think about traditional British fish and chips, a cultural icon. Shops increasingly have to use other whitefish, like pollock, because cod is scarce or too expensive.
Or places like Gloucester, Massachusetts, that historic fishing town.
Yeah, Kurlansky describes it facing a dwindling fishing fleet, the workforce aging, and the town increasingly turning towards tourism to survive. It's a fundamental shift in identity.
And what about the fishermen who are left? How do they see their role?
It's poignant. Many see themselves not just as hunters, but as stewards, as guardians of the sea, holding generations of accumulated knowledge about the ocean. They pose that really challenging question. Who is going to look after the sea if the fishermen are gone?
It's a fair question. It points to this broader shift Kurlansky observes, where we increasingly view nature as something separate, something for entertainment and education like whale watching, rather than as the very source of our sustenance.
A source we depend on, but also have a responsibility towards.
So after this whole incredible journey through history with this one fish, what's the big takeaway for us?
Well, I think the story of cod, as Kurlansky tells it so brilliantly, is just this incredibly powerful case study. It shows how one species can literally change the course of human history, driving exploration, building nations, sparking revolutions.
And ultimately forcing us to confront the fact that nature has limits.
Exactly. It's a story of human ingenuity and ambition, but also of greed and short-sightedness. It really encapsulates our often troubled relationship with the natural world.
We went from thinking, as the old saying went, that you could almost walk across the Atlantic dry shod on the backs of cod,
to a complete fishing ban, declaring them commercially wiped out, all within living memory for some. It's staggering.
The book really feels like both a celebration of this incredible fish and its history, but also a very stark warning.
Absolutely. Kurlansky's core message seems to be that reminder. Man also belongs to the natural world. We're not separate from it.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it? What's our responsibility now, as people who buy fish, as citizens? How do we learn from these limits, push for sustainability, not just for cod, but for all the resources we share?
It's the question, really, and it connects the history of the Grand Banks right back to what's on our own dinner plates today. Every meal truly does have a story, and sometimes, like with cod, it's a story we really need to understand.